Hi everyone, my name is Meron, and today I'm going to talk about the influential Battle of Adwa. So, yeah. Before I start, how many of you, except Addie Crowley and Dr. Donovan, because they're in my class, how many of you have heard of it before today? Okay. So, I'm going to give like a very brief introduction on what it is, and I'm going to talk about the influences it had around the world and on leaders and events. So the Battle of Adwa was a war fought between Ethiopia and Italy in 1896, and this was a loss for Italy and a win for Ethiopia. This is important because this war was fought during the colonial era of Scramble for Africa, which was the occupation, division, and colonization of African territory by European powers during the period of new imperialism between 1881 and 1914. So this was important because during this colonial era, we all know slavery. There was slavery, families were torn apart, colonies were ripped of their natural beauty and resources, and colonizers had control over infrastructure of colonies. So during all this, an African country had won against this colonialism that was taking place. So it showed that that Battle of Adwa was a freedom of people. It was a powerful symbol of freedom of people for multiple ethnic, cultural, and national groups on the continent of Africa and also off of it. And it showed that an African country can successfully repel an attempted colonizer. And this was also important because during that time, only Ethiopia and Liberia were the only two countries that were not colonized out of all the African countries. So the battle had transformative historical and political consequences, which is going to be the focus of my talk. And I will do this by giving examples of African leaders and leaders around the world and, again, events that it has inspired. So I'm going to start off with Nelson Mandela. So for those of you who are not familiar with him, he was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary political leader and philanthropist who served as president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. And his government focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid and tackling institutionalized racism and fostering racial reconciliation. So Mandela, in his book For Long Walk to Freedom, he wrote, and I quote, "Although it had been conquered dozens of times, Ethiopia was the birthplace of African nationalism. Unlike so many other African states, it had fought colonialism at every turn." So it was not just the fact that they won that was important to him, but later on when he went to visit Ethiopia, he wrote in his book, "For the first time in my life, I was witnessing black soldiers commanded by black generals, applauded by black leaders who were all guests of black head of states. It was at that moment I only hoped it was a vision for what lay in the future for my own country." So during that time, of course, other African countries who were also under colonization had militaries and armies. But the difference was they were being led by European generals, and they had to fight the wars of these European countries, and they did not have the option to fight their own wars. But at that time, Ethiopia was being led by her own emperors, and they got to choose the battles that they served. So it echoed a sense of freedom that Nelson Mandela had desired for South Africa. Next slide. So another leader that the Battle of Adwa has influenced is Jomo Kenyatta, who was the former Prime Minister of Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta was a colonial activist and politician who governed Kenya as president from 1964 to 1978, and he played a significant role in transforming Kenya from a British colony to an independent republic. So he commented by saying, "Ethiopia was the sole remaining pride of Africans and black people in all parts of the world." So it inspired him in the process of fighting for Kenya to turn it into a republic, into an independent republic. Next slide. So another event. So the next year, that General Assembly changed into the Organization of the African Union, which is now known as African Union. And the headquarters of African Union is found in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, which is the capital of Ethiopia. So this shows that Ethiopia's leadership among other African countries could be directly attributed to the win during the Battle of Adwa. So this crossed borders, and here in the US, it inspired Dr. Du Bois, who was an American civil rights activist and a major spokesman for freedom of Black people in America. So in his book, The World in Africa, he devoted a whole chapter to Ethiopia and the history of Ethiopia to examine Ethiopia as an idea of global African unity. And so it was not just leaders that the war had inspired, but also individuals across the country, across the continent, and also here in the US. So in 1935, years after the Battle of Adwa, Italy declared another war in Ethiopia as kind of revenge for Adwa. And so during that time, there were civilians here in Harlem, in the US in Harlem, that were protesting against this war. And as you can see by the posters. So they were protesting, and the US government had to put restraints on US citizens from going to Ethiopia and fighting for this war on Ethiopia's side. And this showed that the public saw this second war as a battle to their freedom. So it had inspired all these people throughout the year, and now the Italians wanted to take it back. So it showed how deep Adwa had cut into the desires of freedom of Black people and minorities across the globe. Next one. So other individuals that this war had inspired were two US Army soldiers named John Robinson and Herbert Johnson. So again, during this 1935 war of the Second Ethiopian-Italian War, they volunteered to go to Ethiopia and fight the war on Ethiopia's side. And even after the war was over, John Robinson stayed in Ethiopia to train soldiers and pilots until his death in 1954. So Adwa was symbolic because it disrupted the colonial order in the world, and colonial subjects interpreted Adwa as a resist to defeat colonialism and racial oppression throughout the world. So it was not just it was a way to open deterioration of colonization, not just in Ethiopia, but in the continent of Africa as a whole. So it was not just an event in a single country's history, it was an event that inspired other events and other leaders, which is why I think it should be communicated as such and taught in schools as such. So as to why I believe it wasn't as popular just by the small survey we took in this class, is I'll leave you with a quote from David Deco, who was a former president of Central African Republic. He said, "Ethiopia has taught us to be masters of our continent and to throw back from African soil all foreign powers. Ethiopia's example could not be immediately followed because colonialism was careful not to give publicity to Ethiopia's courageous struggle." And thank you. Any questions or comments?
Do you see any parallels from strange events today anywhere across the world?
Between I think, well, I can't think of a specific one, but in general, if we have an idea of what a certain society of people, their culture is or how they are, whenever they do something out of the norm, it's not easy to admit that it's something different and to shine light upon it. Even like in general, there's always an idea of how African countries are. And whenever they do other stuff or amazing things, it's hard to shine light upon because we want to keep the idea that this is how these group of people are and this is how we are. So like this is how colonizers are or European worlds are. So it's hard to say that at that time the Italians did lose, especially during that high time of them dividing Africa into all these countries and the colonies. So I think in general it's hard to shine light upon something something out of the ordinary or something that we think is out of the ordinary. I can't think of a specific one.
Good answer.
So, you said you gave various leaders that have obviously known about the Battle of Adwa, but why do you think it hasn't been more well known? Like, nobody here knew it. Nobody in our class knew about it before you started talking about it. Why do you think that happened?
So when I was doing my research for this paper, for writing the paper, I was looking at articles from during that time when the war happened, and the way it was reported here in the U.S. was briefly like the Italians lost in the newsletters. It was like the Italians lost, and they gave a whole bunch of reasons as to why they lost, but they did not say that the Ethiopians won and this is something different. But I read one where it says, well, Italians didn't have enough income to control another colony anyway, so it was a good thing that they lost. So it was just excuses as to why they didn't win. Also, I was looking at textbooks from now, world history textbooks, and they barely gave it a paragraph on this battle. So it would just be like the Ethiopians won during that time because they had much more weapons and they outnumbered the Italians. They did outnumber the Italians, but it was because they didn't attribute it to their love for their country that all these people came out to defend it. And they barely gave it a paragraph and said, oh, this happened during this time and that's why. But it never talked about what other things it inspired and what other movements it opened the way to.
Did they have more weapons?
I don't know. I tried looking into that. There was reports on that, but well, it could be because I'm biased, but I grew up in Ethiopia and the way we were taught about it wasn't that we had much more weapons. But I couldn't find evidence as to that.
That's one of my questions for you is when you first learned about Adwa and why you chose to research it for this paper.
Well, I learned about it because I'm from Ethiopia and I grew up there until I was 18, until I moved here for college. So we learned about it in class and
Like what grade? Like elementary school?
Yeah, started
Okay.
actually.
So it's a major event in your country.
Yeah.
in Ethiopia.
So it happened on March 1st, and during that day we don't have class actually.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, we get off class or work, and there's always like festivals held, and we celebrate it. So it was a huge celebration.
What
so
is it called, that holiday?
We just call it Adwa,
Ah.
like the day of Adwa. So even before I officially start learning in class, we were all familiar with it, and then we start learning about it and what it meant to Ethiopians, Africans, and other people. So I researched it because when we were given this assignment, it was close to that anniversary, so I was like, I'll just do that.
And plus you knew a lot of people here probably didn't know about it, right?
Yeah, actually no one I knew about it.
Good, interesting.